It was a Tuesday evening in Flaxborough, which meant that the most distinguished citizens of the borough were gathered beneath the ceiling fans of the Civic Hall, seated around tables dressed in heavy linen, and if the treasurer's calculations were to be believed, paid for almost entirely out of raffle proceeds. The Rotary dinner was not a festive occasion in the ordinary sense. Its gaiety had a practised, municipal quality, like laughter rehearsed at committee stage. Still, the assembled councillors, pharmacists, auctioneers, and respectable widows contrived to look as though nothing delighted them more than lukewarm soup and speeches about drainage improvements. At table number 3, the talk was of bridge hands and whether the bishop would condescend to say grace at next year's event. At table number 6, Mrs. Schultz, whose late husband had once owned 3 successful shoe shops, confided to her neighbour that she had never trusted a man who used too much hair cream. And at table number 1, reserved for the mayor and other local luminaries, the conversation dwindled into a collective cough when a waiter placed before Alderman Wotton a square white envelope propped upright against his bread plate like an additional course. No one remarked on it immediately. The etiquette of such occasions discouraged curiosity, but Alderman Wotton, who had fortified himself with 2 sherries at the bar beforehand, could not resist. He turned the envelope over once, then again, and at last slit it open with the edge of his butter knife. His eyebrows, already inclined to pessimism, rose an inch higher. Without a word, he slid the sheet of paper back inside and lowered it to his lap. The mayor, Mrs. Penelope Wuthers, noticed. She noticed because her eyes had been sharpened by years of council meetings in which the faintest hesitation or misplaced comma might betray an opponent's manoeuvre. Wotton's silence was suspicious, and silence at a Rotary dinner where the object was to appear both prosperous and amiable was positively indecent. It was Mrs. Others, too, who leaned later towards Councillor Peebleshire, voiced careful to carry no further than the thick flowers arranged in the centre of the table, and asked whether Alderman Wotton had seemed himself tonight. Peebles replied with the satisfaction of a man who had recently lost an argument to Wotton in committee that he looked decidedly unwell. By pudding time the envelope had not reappeared, but the tremor of speculation had already travelled. Between coffee cups and over the clatter of teaspoons, theories sprang up as though each guest had been preparing one at home. A discreet note of congratulations on his birthday incorrect by 3 months, an anonymous tip about a council tender most irregular, a bill unlikely since Wotton was as prompt in payment as he was mean in expenditure. Inspector Purbright, seated at the edge of the gathering in what the organisers optimistically called the police liaison chair, was content to watch. He seldom took wine, but made a ritual of swirling it before he sipped, as though inviting it to disclose its character. The inspector was not there to police, precisely more to reassure the town that its protectors were convivial as well as vigilant. He found himself reflecting that the hall smelled less of conviviality than of gravy and dust. He also noticed, without appearing to, that Alderman Wotton did not linger for the loyal toast. He slipped away between speeches, his chair nudged back under the table as neatly as if he had never occupied it. That small politeness would, Purbright knew, be remarked upon and exaggerated until the town had woven from it a narrative more robust than the pudding served that evening. By the next morning, Flaxborough was in possession of a scandal. A letter had been left for Alderman Wotton, and it had contained, so Mrs. Schultz assured the butcher's wife, who then told the grocer's daughter some terrible threat. What the threat was remained unspecified, in fact. The less that was known, the more diligently it was repeated. The local paper, restrained as ever, made no mention of blackmail. It merely reported that an item of correspondence of a private nature had been delivered to Alderman Wotton during the course of the Rotary dinner. But in the snug of the Crown and Mitre that evening, Blackmail was exactly the word spoken with relish by those who considered themselves too sensible to believe gossip, yet always willing to spread it. Inspector Purbright, who had neither confirmed nor denied anything, sat in his office the following day, gazing at the rain streaking down the station window. He turned the matter over in his mind with the same deliberate patience he applied to most things. What intrigued him was not whether a crime had occurred, but why an apparently respectable alderman should wish so determinedly to keep a piece of correspondence hidden beneath the tablecloth of civic propriety. The inspector folded his hands, allowed himself the faintest smile, and decided that a quiet inquiry might be in order. By Thursday morning the envelope had grown in size, substance, and menace, though not one of the town's citizens could have described what it looked like or what words it contained. It had been transformed, as so many events in Flaxborough were, by the industrious alchemy of gossip. What had begun as a small, discreet note had become, through the combined wit of hairdressers, ironmongers, and chapel-goers, a missive thick with scandal, its handwriting bold enough to scorch the page, its message sufficient to unseat a council. Mrs. Schultz, encountering Mr. Cartwright the chemist outside the post office, confided that she had it on the strongest authority that the envelope had contained a demand for money. Cartwright, who had sold cough syrup to Alderman Wotton only a week earlier and was thus a recognized expert on the man's affairs, agreed solemnly that the alderman must have enemies. Within the hour he had mentioned this to two customers who, when they next found themselves in the grocer's, repeated the information with suitable additions. By mid-afternoon, the notion that Wotton was paying for some hidden indiscretion had become as settled in the town's imagination as the market clock striking noon. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had spoken to no one beyond Sergeant Love, who brought into his office the day's crop of reports with a slightly perplexed air. Love was tall, earnest, and prone to a form of honesty that had the effect of making other people sound dishonest merely by comparison. He was also entirely unsuited to the management of rumour, for his inclination was to answer every speculative question with a plain denial. The result was that most townsfolk assumed he was concealing the truth. Purbright listened to his sergeant's account of the town's chatter with a patience that to Love always seemed dangerously close to amusement. When the sergeant concluded that they ought perhaps to summon Wotton at once for an explanation, Purbright shook his head slightly. "We must allow the alderman the opportunity," he said, "to bring the matter to us in his own time. A man who leaves the Rotary dinner early has already betrayed a certain anxiety. Pressing him may only encourage silence." Love frowned. "But if it is blackmail, if it is," Purbright interrupts gently, "then haste will not prevent it. A blackmailer seldom expects promptness. What he desires is submission. Let us see which of those the alderman chooses." The following day brought little clarification, but abundant embroidery. A note delivered by a waiter had become, in the telling, a parcel smuggled under the table. The alderman's pallor, remarked upon by Mrs. Wuthers, had been recast by evening into a collapse narrowly averted by smelling salts. And always, at the heart of these variations, lay the conviction that some shameful secret of public consequence was at stake. In the snug of the Crown and Mitre, Mr. Hopcroft, the auctioneer, declared that the matter could only be connected to the allotment scandal of several years earlier, in which Wotton had been accused, without proof, of securing favourable rents for his brother-in-law. At the ladies' circle in St. Jude's Parish Hall, the opinion was expressed that the alderman's sudden widowerhood 2 winters ago had perhaps not been entirely natural. Even the milkman contributed, pointing out that he had once seen Wotton receive a registered letter at his door with a look of such apprehension that it could not have been anything but sinister. Purbright heard these things not by seeking them, but by allowing them to drift naturally into his path. He had the gift, or perhaps the habit, of making himself available to gossip without ever appearing to invite it. By Saturday afternoon, he possessed a collection of theories so elaborate that the truth, whatever it was, would almost certainly prove more prosaic. Yet within that prosaic truth, he knew, lay the kernel of real interest. It was on Saturday evening, as the inspector walked past the alderman's neat red-brick house, that he noticed a small irregularity. The curtains were drawn, though the hour was barely 6, and in the front window a vase of chrysanthemums stood at a slightly awkward angle, as if placed there in haste. It was no proof of anything, but to Purbright's eye it spoke of a household unsettled. He filed the image away as carefully as any report. Sunday in Flaxborough brought the usual rituals of church, roast beef, and restrained conversation about the weather. Yet beneath the hymns and the passing of collection plates, the town hummed with its newfound drama. Alderman Wotton did not attend morning service, which caused more remarks than his presence would have done. His absence was interpreted variously as guilt, fear, or defiance. Purbright spent part of the afternoon reading through old committee records in the station, an occupation which to Sergeant Love seemed curiously unrelated to the case. The inspector explained, when pressed, that a man's public history often whispered more about his private present than people realized. He lingered particularly over minutes of a park subcommittee in which Wotton had argued at unusual length about the allocation of a minor landscaping contract. The matter had seemed trivial at the time, but Purbright marked it as worthy of later reflection. That evening, as the town prepared itself for another week of routine, the inspector received his first formal approach. Alderman Wotton, pale but composed, entered the station lobby and asked to see him privately. He carried no papers and offered no greeting beyond the minimum courtesy. "Inspector," he began, "there has been a foolish misunderstanding. A letter was delivered to me at the Rotary dinner. Its contents were of a personal nature, of no concern to the public or the police. I would be obliged if you would put an end to this speculation." Purbright regarded him steadily. "It is difficult to put an end to speculation, Alderman. It thrives on what is withheld more than on what is known." "Then tell them," Wotton said sharply, "that it was nothing." The inspector inclined his head. "Very well. But might I inquire, if it was nothing, why you left so abruptly that evening?" Wotton hesitated, then produced a phrase as stiff as the collar of his shirt. "I was unwell." "That may be so," Purbright replied mildly. "And yet if you find yourself troubled further by letters of no consequence, you may rely on our assistance." The alderman muttered his thanks and departed. Purbright remained seated, his expression unaltered, but in his mind the inquiry had begun in earnest. For it was not what Wotton had said that interested him, but the way in which he had pronounced the word "nothing" as if it were heavier than the truth. "Inspector, Purbright was not in the habit of pursuing men the moment they turned defensive. He preferred instead to wait, allowing the pressure of circumstance and curiosity to soften whatever armour they had hastily put on. Alderman Wotton's brusque dismissal at the station had not discouraged him. It had rather confirmed the existence of something behind the alderman's careful facade. Whether it was crime, embarrassment, or merely the vanity of a public man too proud to appear vulnerable, Purbright had not yet decided, but there was enough to justify a little gentle inquiry. On Monday morning he called upon the Rotary Dinners Committee Secretary, Mr. Arthur Crooms, who ran a stationer's shop on High Street, and considered himself a guardian of civic records of all kinds, from raffle books to mayoral addresses. Crooms was a man whose spectacles seemed to magnify his sense of responsibility more than his vision, and when the inspector explained that he was looking into the matter of the mysterious envelope, he brightened with the relief of someone invited at last to share what he had been bursting to disclose. "Yes, Inspector, The envelope was indeed delivered by one of the waiters, not one of ours, you understand, hired from the hotel in Thimbleby. A tall lad, dark hair, pale face, carried himself rather stiffly, I thought. When I asked later whether he knew who had handed him the note, he said it had been given to him at the kitchen door by a person he did not recognize. A woman, he thought, veiled, or perhaps simply holding her scarf too close. He was vague on that point. Purbright nodded slowly. "And did you keep the name of this waiter?" Crooms produced, with a flourish, a small notebook in which he had listed every temporary employee. One name, written in a hand firmer than the others, caught Purbright's eye: Sidney Liddell. That afternoon, the inspector and Sergeant Love walked to the hotel in Thimbleby. The manager, a brisk woman whose tone suggested she had been let down by men too often to trust them, recalled Sidney Liddell with faint irritation. A student, she said, who worked occasional shifts, diligent enough, though inclined to talk more about politics than crockery. Yes, he had been on duty the night of the dinner, and yes, he had mentioned being asked to deliver a note. He seemed proud of it, as though entrusted with a secret mission. They found Liddell in lodgings above a bicycle repair shop, a thin youth whose spectacles slipped perpetually down his nose. He confirmed without hesitation that he had been given the envelope by a woman outside the kitchen. Asked to describe her, he could only say she wore gloves and spoke in a low voice. Not young, he thought, but not old either. He had not seen her face clearly. "And what made you think she wanted you to deliver it to Alderman Wotton in particular?" Purbright asked gently. "Because she said so, sir. She told me quite firmly to put it before Alderman Wotton, and no one else." There was no threat in her tone. "No, sir. More like insistence, as if it were urgent and personal." Purbright regarded the youth for a moment, then asked if he had looked inside the envelope. Liddell flushed, shaking his head so earnestly that even Sergeant Love seemed convinced. The inspector thanked him and left, noting only that the boy's account, though guileless, did nothing to resolve the essential puzzle: why Wotton should tremble before a message sent with such deliberate but subdued urgency. The following day, Purbright made another call, this time upon the mayor, Mrs. Wuthers. She received him in her drawing-room, surrounded by porcelain figurines arranged with a precision that suggested council minutes had been rehearsed here more than once. She was eager to speak of Wotton, though cloaked her eagerness with an air of civic duty. "Inspector, I observed the alderman closely that evening, and I tell you there was something unnatural in his manner. He has always been pompous, of course, but never evasive. When that envelope appeared, he seemed a man suddenly confronted with his own reflection, and not liking what he saw. I cannot say what the letter contained, but it is clear to me that it struck at some private vulnerability." Purbright smiled faintly. "You did not, by chance, glimpse any of the contents?" "Certainly not, but I did see him fold it into his lap, as though ashamed to have it visible." The inspector thanked her, declining the offer of seed cake, and walked back through the drizzle of the afternoon with his hands deep in his coat pockets. He knew by now that the town had settled upon blackmail as its favourite explanation. But he wondered whether the truth might not be stranger and perhaps meaner than that. Blackmail required an offender of some cunning. Flaxborough, in his experience, more often produced offenders of clumsiness, dressed up as respectability. Later that evening, Sergeant Love returned from a discreet inquiry at Wotton's offices. He reported that the alderman had been distracted all day, short-tempered with his clerks, and that a caller, Mr. Jasper Critchley, a solicitor of minor standing, had been closeted with him for nearly an hour. Critchley was not a man usually linked with council affairs. Love, earnest as ever, asked whether they should bring him in at once. Purbright shook his head. "Not yet. Men like Critchley talk most freely when they believe no one has noticed them. Let us allow him a little time to reveal what he wishes to hide. And so the inspector's inquiry advanced, not through confrontation, but through patience. He had spoken to the secretary, the waiter, and the mayor. Each offered fragments, half-truths, and impressions. Wotton remained silent, but silence itself was a kind of testimony. Purbright sensed that the alderman was waiting for something, perhaps a second letter, perhaps a demand, yet unvoiced. As he walked home that night beneath the faint yellow glow of the street lamps, Purbright considered again the word nothing, spoken so heavily by Wotton in his office. In Flaxborough, nothing was ever as empty as it sounded, and when respectable men insisted too strongly upon it, there was usually something small, sharp and awkward, lodged beneath the surface, waiting for the lightest touch to make it visible. By the end of the week, the talk had grown too insistent for Alderman Wotton's dignity to endure. He was seen less often in the High Street, and when he did appear, it was in the company of his clerk, as though the presence of another man lent him some shield against speculation. His attempts to maintain normality only sharpened the appetite of the town. People whispered more freely when the subject of their gossip walked stiffly past them. The envelope had become less a rumour than a theatre in which each citizen rehearsed a personal interpretation of guilt. It was on Friday morning that Councillor Peebles, red-faced and irritable as always, called at the police station. He marched into Purbright's office and declared with the confidence of a man certain of his own prudence that the whole matter could be settled if the inspector would only act with a little firmness. "It is obvious, Purbright," Peebles announced, "that some discontented employee or tradesman is trying to shake down Wotton. He has made enemies enough in his time. Why, half the gardeners and contractors in the borough have complained of his parsimony. If you ask me, one of them has taken to threats. What we need is a brisk round of questioning, a show of strength. The fellow will soon confess when he sees we mean business." Purbright listened with the mild attention of a man prepared to accept all advice and follow none. He agreed it was conceivable that a disgruntled tradesman might be involved, and he promised that discreet inquiries would be made. This satisfied Peebles, who departed, convinced that he had at last put the investigation on the right track. Sergeant Love, however, was less sure. He regarded the councillor's theory with suspicion, but admitted that Wotton's reputation for sharp dealings in contracts was widely known. It would not be unreasonable, he suggested, to look into the accounts of recent council tenders. Purbright allowed him to proceed, though with the caution that eagerness often revealed more about the investigator than about the investigated. Love set about the task with earnest vigour, and within 2 days he had discovered that one small contractor, a Mr. Edwin Goff, had indeed been heard to complain loudly in the public bar about payments delayed by Wotton's office. Goff, who repaired fences and occasionally undertook minor roadworks, was not a man of subtle character. He swore readily, drank freely, and was thought by most of the town to have married above his station. When Purbright visited him on Saturday afternoon, Goff received the inspector in his yard, among piles of timber and a rusting wheelbarrow. His manner was defensive, as though every question were a prelude to accusation. Yes, he admitted, he had cursed Wotton more than once. Yes, the alderman owed him money well, not personally owed, but had delayed authorization for payment until half his men threatened to leave. Yes, he could imagine someone wanting to send Wotton an unpleasant note, but he denied with vehemence that he had done so himself. "If I had wanted to threaten him, Inspector," he said, "I'd have gone straight to his office and told him what I thought. I've no patience for sneaking about with envelopes." The denial was forceful enough to be persuasive, but Purbright did not dismiss him entirely. He knew the town would be eager to see a man like Goff blamed rough, resentful, publicly at odds with Wotton. It was too neat a candidate for blame. And neatness, in crime as in politics, seldom survived examination. That evening, Sergeant Love returned with further news. He had spoken to several men who worked with Goff, and one of them swore he had seen Goff in the vicinity of the Civic Hall on the night of the Rotary dinner, loitering outside the kitchens. The testimony was second-hand and uncertain, but it was enough to add colour to suspicion. Purbright listened patiently, then asked whether the man might simply have been mistaken. Love admitted it was possible, but he insisted that the coincidence was troubling. The inspector smiled faintly. Coincidences, Sergeant, are plentiful in small towns. What matters is whether a man's character fits the deed. Goff's character, to my mind, fits better with noisy complaints than with silent menace. Nevertheless, Purbright resolved to keep the contractor under observation. He knew that a false suspect could be as instructive as a true one. A man wrongly accused often revealed more in his protests than he ever intended. On Sunday morning, Flaxborough awoke to a new embellishment of the story. It was said, with the solemnity of certain knowledge, that Alderman Wotton had been forced to pay out a large sum in cash. Where this information had originated no one could say, but by the time church was over, half the congregation had accepted it as fact. Wotton himself was absent again, which lent the rumour a credibility it might otherwise have lacked. Purbright, observing all this from the edges of conversation, noted that speculation was now moving beyond curiosity to judgment. The town was preparing to decide what crime had occurred and who had committed it. If left unchecked, such certainty would harden into myth. It was time, he thought, to test the shape of events with a firmer hand. On Monday morning, he invited Goff to the station for a formal interview. The contractor arrived truculent but apprehensive, wiping his boots loudly on the mat, as though to advertise his defiance. Purbright greeted him with polite courtesy, offered him a chair, and asked only a handful of questions. Goff repeated his earlier denials more loudly this time and added several indelicate remarks about Wotton's character. When he left, still swearing under his breath, Purbright turned to Love and remarked that a guilty man seldom volunteered such an abundance of insult. And yet, despite this, the figure of Goff lingered in the imagination of the town. He was rough, he was resentful, he was visible. People preferred a culprit who could be seen and disapproved of in daylight rather than a shadow they could not identify. By the week's end, it was generally believed that the police were close to making an arrest. Purbright did nothing to discourage the belief. He allowed the gossip to follow its own path, knowing that in doing so it might flush out something unexpected. For he had observed one small detail that no one else seemed to have noticed when Goff had been told of the mysterious envelope. He had asked, with a puzzled frown, whether it had contained a photograph. He had then covered his question with a cough and pressed no further. That odd remark, unconnected to anything known, interested the inspector more than all the man's denials. For if Goff, in his ignorance, had guessed at something so precise, perhaps he was not so ignorant after all. Inspector Purbright spent the better part of the following day considering that careless question of Goff's, a photograph. The man had blurted it out with the bluntness of someone too used to speaking without thinking. Then, realizing he had perhaps said too much, he had smothered the slip with a cough. That to Purbright was more revealing than any formal denial. For there was no reason, unless prompted by some previous knowledge, to imagine that the envelope had contained a picture rather than words. And yet Goff had done so, unprompted, as if his mind had gone straight to it. Still, Purbright was too seasoned to leap on such a fragment. People's tongues often ran ahead of their senses. He let the remark sit, neither discarding it nor fastening upon it, while he continued to observe the larger pattern of the town's chatter. If Goff truly knew something, he would betray himself again, perhaps in some trivial aside. Meanwhile, Alderman Wotton grew visibly more strained. His clerks whispered that he had taken to locking himself in his office at lunch, where once he would stroll out to the cafe opposite for a plate of sausages. He appeared late at meetings, spoke abruptly, and carried an air of distraction that did not escape his fellow councillors. A man accustomed to exerting his influence with the calm weight of authority now seemed to flinch at shadows. Sergeant Love, with an earnestness bordering on indignation, insisted that Gough must be pressed harder. He argued that the contractor's outburst about the photograph was plain evidence of guilty knowledge. Purbright, however, demurred. "No, Sergeant," he said softly. "It is not evidence. It is suggestion. Evidence compels belief. Suggestion merely invites it. We must not confuse the two." On Wednesday evening, Purbright decided to make a quiet call at Wotton's house. The alderman's servant, a sharp-featured woman of indeterminate age, admitted him reluctantly, and Purbright was shown into a sitting-room where the curtains were drawn, though it was still daylight outside. Wotton sat stiffly in an armchair, a newspaper, folded but unread, upon his knee. "Inspector," he said without warmth, "this persecution must end. I have endured whispers in the street, sniggers at meetings. It is intolerable." "I regret it," Purbright replied, "but you know as well as I that such whispers do not begin without some spark." "You could extinguish them, Alderman, if you chose to trust us with the truth." Wotton's face coloured. "There is no truth, Inspector, nothing beyond malice and invention." "Perhaps," Purbright said mildly. "Yet people seldom invent out of nothing." "Even malice requires some nourishment." Wotton turned away, his fingers tightening on the newspaper. "I will not discuss it further." The inspector rose, inclined his head politely, and took his leave. He had pressed enough to confirm what he already suspected, that Wotton feared the contents of the envelope, not because they were untrue, but because they touched a nerve he dared not expose. The following morning brought a development both small and curious. Mrs. Jessup, who managed the lost property box at the Civic Hall, called at the station with an object she thought might interest the police. It was a glove, black kid leather, worn but neatly kept, found beneath one of the tables after the Rotary dinner. She had held on to it for a fortnight in case its owner returned, but no one had claimed it. Purbright examined the glove with quiet interest. A woman's size, too small for comfort, the stitching near the wrist just beginning to fray. Nothing about it at first glance seemed remarkable, and yet he could not dismiss it. A single glove left behind at an event where a mysterious envelope had also been delivered hinted at a connection perhaps only circumstantial, but enough to warrant thought. He asked Mrs. Jessup to describe where it had been found. She pursed her lips. "Table 1, Inspector." "The mayor's table." That, Purbright reflected later, was precisely where the envelope had appeared. The oddity was not that a glove had been lost, but that no woman at that table had been seen to miss one. Women were seldom careless with gloves. In Flaxborough, gloves were as much a badge of respectability as a hat in church. To lose one and not reclaim it suggested something hurried, something deliberate. He placed the glove carefully in his desk drawer. By afternoon the town had heard of it, for Mrs. Jessup was not a woman to conceal information that might enhance her sense of civic importance. The gossip mill embraced the glove with enthusiasm, weaving it instantly into the growing fabric of scandal. Some said it belonged to a mysterious lady caller who had threatened Wotton. Others insisted it had been left by a jealous rival at the dinner. A few whispered that it was evidence of a secret liaison between the alderman and some unnamed woman. Purbright, listening to these theories as they floated across shop counters and bar stools, allowed himself the faintest smile. The glove, like the envelope, had become whatever the town wished it to be, but for him it was simply an oddity, a small discordant note in an otherwise predictable melody. It was the sort of detail that did not shout but murmured, and he had learned long ago that truth often travelled by murmur. That evening, walking back along the high street as gaslight began to flicker on, Purbright paused before the window of the photographer's studio. Displayed there were portraits of families, brides, and solemn children with ribbons in their hair. He studied them for a moment, thinking of Gough's question about a photograph, and then of the glove, small enough to have belonged to a woman in one of those stiffly posed images. Perhaps the envelope had not contained words at all. Perhaps it had carried a picture, one that Wotton would have recognized instantly and dreaded to see. He resumed his walk, his mind turning the thoughts slowly, without haste. In Flaxborough the truth was seldom dramatic. It was usually petty, awkward, and faintly ridiculous. But even ridiculous secrets could ruin men of standing if revealed in the wrong light. By the time he reached home, Purbright had resolved that his next step would not be to confront Wotton or Gough, but to inquire gently, politely, about the town's photographers, their patrons, and the quiet commerce of images that men preferred to keep hidden. For if a photograph was indeed at the heart of this matter, it would not have sprung from nowhere. And someone, somewhere in Flaxborough, must know why a single glove had been left beneath the mayor's table on the night of the Rotary dinner. Inspector Purbright's inquiries took him the next morning to the modest premises of Mr. Fenning, Flaxborough's most enduring photographer. Fenning had occupied the same shop for 30 years, peering at the town through his tripod as though the world were a sequence of stiff arrangements. The walls of his studio were hung with examples of his work, wedding parties frozen in perpetual discomfort, prize-winning Marrows clasped proudly to their growers' chests, and one enormous portrait of the late mayoress, whose stern gaze seemed to reproach the room for existing at all. Fenning himself was a man of yellowed fingers and deliberate movements. He did not gossip in the way most of Flaxborough did, but his profession had made him custodian of countless private vanities. People trusted him with what they would never tell a neighbour. Purbright, entering with his usual mild air, asked, without preamble, whether any recent commissions might have involved Alderman Wotton. Fenning adjusted his spectacles. "Not directly, Inspector. I cannot recall the alderman sitting for a portrait since his wife passed away." But his voice slowed. "Someone did inquire about negatives, old ones. That would be, let me see, a fortnight ago. A lady asked whether I still held photographs of a certain council dinner 15 years past. I told her I did not, for I never keep such things longer than a year or two. She seemed disappointed, but also rather anxious that I not mention her visit." "Did she give a name?" Purbright asked. "She did not. But she was careful in dress, gloved as though she did not wish her hands to be recognized." Purbright thanked him and left with a sense that the circle around Wotton was widening. Here was another woman, or perhaps the same as the one who had pressed the envelope into the waiter's hands. Gloves again. The inspector thought of the single glove in his drawer. These details did not yet form a picture, but they suggested the edges of one. That afternoon he took a quiet walk through the market, stopping at stalls more often for conversation than for purchases. He spoke with Mrs. Dabb, who sold haberdashery, and with Mr. Willison, the bookseller, both of whom had noticed a woman in recent days asking questions about old newspapers, particularly those containing photographs of civic functions. She had described herself as a collector, but the eagerness with which she pressed her inquiries had made her memorable. No one knew her name. Sergeant Love, when told of these reports, grew excited. "Then surely, sir, this is our culprit. A woman prowling after old photographs connected with the glove at the dinner. What more can we need?" "What we need," Purbright replied calmly, "is to know what she hoped to find. Until then, she is no more than a shadow." By the end of the week, however, the shadow had acquired a sharper outline. The Crown and Mitres landlord reported to the inspector that a stranger had taken a room there under the name of Mrs. Simmons, a quiet woman, middle-aged, with a voice pitched lower than most. She came and went irregularly, asked many questions about local councillors, and seemed particularly interested in Alderman Wotton's career. Purbright walked past the inn that evening, glancing up at its curtained windows. He did not attempt to call the time was not yet right. He preferred to let her continue her search to see what quarry she pursued before stepping across her path. Meanwhile, the alderman himself was fraying further under the strain. He had been overheard in sharp words with his solicitor Critchley outside the town hall. Rumour quickly inflated this into a quarrel over hush money, and by Sunday evening it was generally believed that Wotton had mortgaged his house to pay off a blackmailer. None of this was confirmed, but Wotton's drawn face and abrupt manner gave it colour enough. Purbright considered all this quietly. He noticed, with the eye of habit, that Wotton's gait had changed. The man who once strode pompously across the square now walked as though expecting a hand on his shoulder. Fear, Purbright knew, was more eloquent than words. It was on Monday morning that an apparently unconnected piece of news reached the station. Mr. Fenning, the photographer, had suffered a break-in. Nothing was stolen, or so it seemed at first glance, but his drawers of negatives had been rifled. He insisted he had no enemies, but admitted, under questioning, that the incident might be connected to the woman who had asked about old pictures. The inspector visited the shop himself, noting the careful disorder left behind, a search that was deliberate, not wanton. Someone had been looking for a particular image. Later, in his office, Purbright placed the glove on his desk and studied it beside Sergeant Love's notes on Gough and the rumours of Mrs. Simmons. The pieces remained scattered, but one thread emerged. Someone wanted to unearth, or perhaps to resurrect, a fragment of the past, and that fragment, whatever it was, had the power to unsettle Alderman Wotton more than any threat of present scandal. As dusk settled over Flaxborough, Purbright sat back and allowed his mind to dwell on human nature. People did not invent secrets, they only revived them. The town, with its appetite for scandal, would happily supply the echo. But the original sound, the first sharp strike, came from something real, something buried. He knew now that his task was to follow that echo back to its source. And as he closed the drawer upon the glove once more, he resolved that the next step would be a quiet visit to Mrs. Simmons, whose questions about old photographs had stirred the dust of a story that Flaxborough, it seemed, had half forgotten. Inspector Purbright had resolved to pay a quiet call upon Mrs. Simmons on Wednesday afternoon. The day was cool, with a fine drizzle that made the High Street glisten under its lamplight. He arrived at the Crown and Mitre just after 2 o'clock and inquired politely at the reception for Mrs. Simmons's room. The landlord, a man of keen observation and a memory of minor scandals, nodded toward the second floor with that mixture of courtesy and discretion that only the innkeepers of small towns could muster. The woman received him promptly, without visible surprise, as if she had expected him, or perhaps as if she had anticipated someone eventually tracing the envelope, the glove, or the disturbances in Wotton's routine back to her presence. She was neat, composed, and deliberately undemonstrative, wearing gloves of a finer leather than the one found under the mayor's table, though they too were black. Her hat, set low, cast a shadow over her eyes. Inspector Purbright introduced himself courteously and explained that he was inquiring, in a routine manner, about the photographs she had requested at Mr. Fenning's studio. Mrs. Simmons nodded with a faint smile that suggested both amusement and caution. "Yes," she said, "I asked for some photographs. Very old ones. I am collecting illustrations of civic life, of ordinary people and the minor events that define a town." It was nothing more than curiosity, she insisted. Purbright listened, as he often did, to the subtleties of speech rather than its overt meaning. Curiosity, he noted, rarely took such careful measures. Gloves, the insistence on anonymity, repeated visits to the photographer, all of these were excessive for mere academic interest. He asked gently whether she had seen Alderman Wotton at the Rotary dinner, or whether her inquiries were connected in any way to him. Mrs. Simmons's expression shifted, but she answered without hesitation. "I saw him, naturally. He was the mayor's guest at the table with the other dignitaries. But I have no quarrel with him, and no business of any sort requiring correspondence." Purbright inclined his head. And yet she had sent the envelope through the waiter. That is what the boy Sidney Liddell reported. Mrs. Simmons regarded him evenly. "A boy, Inspector, may imagine more than he sees. Perhaps the envelope was given, as you say, but perhaps it was another. One cannot be sure." Purbright made no immediate reply. He was interested less in confession than in observation of the small details that could reveal intent more accurately than any hurried admission. The way she held her hands, the minute flicker across her eyes when Wotton was mentioned, the subtle tension in her voice, these were all parts of a map leading somewhere. They spoke of the Civic Hall, the Rotary dinner, the social rhythms of Flaxborough. She was precise, careful, and calm. No outward signs of agitation, no misplaced words. And yet Purbright could not dismiss the possibility that she carried knowledge of a secret, one powerful enough to unbalance an alderman long accustomed to command and control. Later that day, Purbright and Sergeant Love walked along the market lanes, retracing some of the steps Mrs. Simmons might have taken. They spoke with tradesmen and townsfolk whose brief encounters with her had been noted. One or two remembered that she had asked specifically about photographs of Wotton in committees or at public functions. Another recalled her gloved hands, noting the unusual care she had taken not to reveal her features. Love, ever earnest, suggested that she might be a blackmailer after all. Purbright replied, as he often did when confronted with eager conclusions, that the measure of guilt was rarely in what people did, but in why they did it. At present, Mrs. Simmons had acted within the bounds of ordinary inquiry, however meticulous, and nothing indicated she had yet delivered a threat. By Friday evening, a new development further complicated the picture. Mrs. Wuthers, the mayor, informed Purbright in a discreet note that she had heard of a second envelope, delivered not to Wotton, but to the office of Critchley, his solicitor. Critchley, of course, had met with Wotton for an extended period that week, though the nature of their conversation was unknown. The timing, however, suggested coordination, and the inspector could not ignore it. That night he considered the sequence of events: the glove, the envelope, Goff's unwitting remark about a photograph, Mrs. Simmons's inquiries, and now a second communication to the solicitor. Each, taken alone, was ambiguous together. They formed a pattern, faint and tentative, but unmistakable to an eye accustomed to observing subtle movements in a small town. He reflected, too, on the role of Flaxborough itself. The town was a community of careful observers, prone to embellishment, eager for scandal, and quick to assign guilt. It had already chosen Goff, and it was beginning to knit Mrs. Simmons into a story that cast her as a mysterious instigator. In doing so, the town offered Purbright an unusual advantage by letting their imagination run. He might observe the reactions, the slips and the errors that would reveal more than the witnesses themselves intended. The inspector resolved that the next stage of inquiry would require patience, a watchful eye, and the gentle orchestration of social circumstances. He would need to allow the participants, the alderman, Goff, and Mrs. Simonstow, act within their accustomed routines. Only then would the contradictions and the hesitations emerge with clarity, and so he closed his notebook, noting that the week's quiet observations had revealed both the extent and the subtlety of human concern. A single envelope, a lost glove, and the unspoken weight of curiosity and fear were enough to rattle a man in a town accustomed to predictability. Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. The game was now well and truly afoot. The players were in place, and the town, in its eagerness to embellish, would provide both motive and cover for the truths that remained to be uncovered. Monday morning brought with it a faint drizzle, the kind that made the cobbles of Flaxborough glisten and encouraged townsfolk to speak less loudly, or at least with more discretion. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station early, enjoying the quiet before the predictable bustle of gossip, deliveries, and minor grievances. He poured himself a cup of tea, watched the steam curl toward the ceiling, and allowed the events of the past fortnight to unfold in his mind like a well-thumbed ledger. Alderman Wotton's behaviour remained the same, outwardly stiff, precise, and superficially composed, but inwardly, as Purbright had already deduced, he was on edge. He avoided the high street at busy hours, spoke curtly to clerks, and had taken to sitting behind his desk with letters unopened, as if hoping they might vanish. The envelope from the Rotary dinner, and now the second missive to his solicitor, had established a rhythm of anticipation that the alderman could neither escape nor quite manage. Purbright considered Gough too. The contractor was a creature of habitual complaints and public bluster, the kind of man who would take every opportunity to vent frustration. Yet he had not, to Purbright's satisfaction, shown the traits of someone engaged in the careful orchestration of threats. His knowledge of a photograph, mentioned in passing, remained intriguing but ambiguous. It might indicate awareness, or it might be a coincidence, a slip of imagination typical of the garrulous and the unpracticed. The glove, still resting in the inspector's desk drawer, had become emblematic of the puzzle. Small, perfectly formed, abandoned beneath the mayor's table, it was a trace of deliberate neglect. Whoever had left it behind had done so with purpose, and yet no one had claimed it since. Its absence had not been noted immediately, and in a town so meticulous about appearances that suggested either carelessness on the part of a visitor or the calculated subtlety of someone accustomed to concealment. As he sipped his tea, Purbright reflected on Mrs. Simmons. She was careful, deliberate, and observant, inquiring about photographs with gloves on her hands and a shadow over her face. To the casual eye, she was nothing more than a polite collector. To the careful eye, she was a subtle agent, moving quietly within the social structures of Flaxborough, her interest pinpointed and persistent. The inspector made a mental note the pattern of these small, polite actions. The glove, the envelope, the inquiries was not random. Someone had chosen them deliberately, each act calibrated to unsettle and provoke. But why, and to what end? He considered the town itself. Flaxborough had long been a place where respectability was both shield and weapon. The smallest indiscretion could be magnified through conversation, and the smallest hint of scandal could travel faster than the most carefully planned civic announcement. In such an environment, a letter, a glove, or a photograph could be as devastating as a public accusation. Purbright rose from his chair and began pacing slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Human nature, he reflected, rarely acted in isolation. The alderman's fear was fed not only by the actual content of these communications, but by the imagined consequences, the anticipation of judgment by peers, friends, and the ever-watchful town. Likewise, Mrs. Simmons, if she was indeed orchestrating this, relied upon the town's own eagerness to embellish, to carry her subtle influence further than she could herself. He paused at the window, looking out at the drizzle-slicked street, imagining the patterns of movement he had observed, tradesmen walking briskly with errands, the occasional housewife with a wicker basket, and children scuttling past on errands for their parents. Each carried the potential for observation, for reporting, for minor mischief. Each could be an unwitting witness or unwilling participant in a drama that had begun with an envelope and a glove. Sergeant Love entered with the day's reports. Nothing definitive, he said, but several more people had mentioned Mrs. Simmons's inquiries and her questions about Alderman Wotton. Purbright nodded. "Let the pattern build," he said quietly. "People will reveal their own secrets through their assumptions and omissions." Later, the inspector took his customary walk through the market lanes, noting the rhythm of town life. He observed the butcher arguing politely with a customer over the price of beef, the milliner arranging hats in the window with care, and a cluster of women comparing patterns of embroidery as though the subject were of grave importance. He reflected that it was in these ordinary movements, in the casual decisions, and the almost imperceptible shifts of manners, that truth often whispered loudest. Back at his office, Purbright opened the drawer and examined the glove once more. Its small size, the careful stitching, the worn leather, it was tangible, discreet, and eloquent in its silence. He allowed his mind to wander through possibilities, the glove as a signal, the glove as a marker, the glove as a token of something seen but not yet acknowledged. By evening, he had settled upon a strategy. The town had furnished him with suspects, each with plausible motives and contradictory behavior. It had furnished him with incidents, small oddities, and rumors. Now it was time to allow human nature to take its course, to observe how these individuals would act when the pressure of curiosity, guilt, or anticipation bore down upon them. He would watch, he would listen, and he would note. As he closed the shutters against the evening drizzle, Purbright reflected that the next step in the inquiry would require patience, subtlety, and the ability to read the faintest cues of human anxiety. Gough, Wotton, Mrs. Simmons, and the town itself were all parts of a delicate choreography. Any misstep might reveal more than a direct confrontation ever could. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, allowed its warmth to settle, and considered the sequence of events, the envelope at the dinner, the abandoned glove, the inquiries about photographs, the second missive to the solicitor, and the growing tension in Wotton's behavior. Each element was a brushstroke in a picture that would become clearer in time, and, as always, it was the smallest strokes that often revealed the truest outline of human intention. The following morning, Inspector Purbright set about a subtle experiment, one designed less to question than to observe. He had learned that direct confrontation in Flaxborough, particularly with men and women of standing, often produced either evasion or defensiveness, neither of which revealed as much as one might hope. Instead, he devised a polite but deliberate ruse, a staged meeting under the guise of routine inquiries into the town's civic records. He sent a brief note to Alderman Wotton, requesting a discussion on the allocation of minor contracts and the maintenance of council archives. The message, carefully phrased to imply official business, was designed to bring the alderman into the police station without alarming him. Wotton, predictably, arrived with measured haste, his face a portrait of controlled apprehension. Purbright greeted him courteously, led him into the office, and allowed him to settle into a chair. He spoke of council records, recent tenders, and the minutiae of civic administration, all in a tone of mild interest and dispassionate attention. Throughout, he watched Wotton's reactions with quiet scrutiny. There was a flicker of unease when Purbright casually mentioned the Rotary dinner, and a sharp attention when the glove, innocently placed on a side table, caught Wotton's eye. The alderman cleared his throat. "Inspector," he said, "I do not wish to trouble you with my personal affairs." "Of course," Purbright replied smoothly, "but sometimes, Alderman, personal affairs are inseparable from public perception. A man cannot act in Flaxborough without the town interpreting his movements. Wotton nodded, shifting in his chair, and for a moment the room was filled only with the soft tick of the wall clock. Then Purbright allowed a faint, casual remark. "It seems a lady has been quite interested in past photographs of council dinners. Curious, is it not, that such interest coincides with letters delivered to private hands?" The effect was immediate, though subtle. Wotton's fingers tightened slightly on the arms of his chair. His eyes flicked toward the glove. He said nothing, but the tension that had hitherto been contained in measured gestures now manifested in an almost imperceptible tremor of the lips. Sergeant Love, observing from a discreet angle, could hardly conceal his anticipation. The inspector, however, did not rush to speak. He allowed the silence to linger, knowing that it was in such moments that truth often slipped through the cracks of careful defences. After several minutes, Wotton cleared his throat again, this time less brusquely. "Perhaps," he said, "it is foolish of one to pay attention to trifles." The letters were harmless, the photograph likely inconsequential. He forced a faint laugh. "A man in my position must not be so easily perturbed." Purbright's eyes, thoughtful and unobtrusive, remained upon him. "Indeed," he said gently, "but it is remarkable how trifles, letters, gloves, photographs can exert a curious influence over even the most careful of men." Wotton's glance fell upon the glove once more. "Inspector," he began, voice tight, "I have no quarrel with anyone. I do not wish to pursue to inquire." "No one expects you to," Purbright replied, "but the world has a way of pressing observation upon one even when one wishes to avoid it." After a pause, Wotton rose, adjusted his coat, and muttered an acknowledgment. Purbright allowed him to leave, noting the careful manner in which the alderman navigated the doorway, as if ensuring he left no hint of agitation behind. Outside, Wotton paused briefly as though considering turning back, and then continued down the high street at his usual measured pace. The experiment had accomplished what Purbright intended. The alderman's composure remained outwardly intact, yet the smallest tremors, the fleeting hesitation, revealed more than any direct question could have coaxed. The interplay of suggestion, observation, and circumstance had begun to extract the truth without confrontation. Later that afternoon, Purbright visited Gough once more, under the pretence of discussing a minor repair job he had been commissioned to report. He noted the contractor's habitual bluster, but now, under observation, Gough's manner carried a subtle difference. There was caution in his gestures, an uncertainty previously absent. When the inspector mentioned the Rotary dinner in passing, Gough's brow furrowed, though he attempted to conceal it. And when the glove was referenced innocuously, Gough's hands tightened, and he muttered about women being too fussy with such trifles. It was a pattern of response. Purbright observed small hesitations, brief ticks, the momentary diversion of the eyes. All human behavior, all too revealing if one knew what to watch for. He noted each detail in his mind with care, comparing it against the previous observations of Wotton and Mrs. Simmons. By evening, the inspector had drawn a tentative outline of the dynamic at play. Wotton, anxious yet determined to maintain dignity, Gough aware of some peripheral truth but restrained by habit. Mrs. Simmons, subtle and methodical, testing the reactions of those she observed, and the town, ever eager to elaborate upon the hints and gaps they encountered. As he sat by the window in the fading light, he reflected on the ingenuity of quiet manoeuvre. Often it was less the direct action than the careful orchestration of observation that revealed intent, and the small details, a glove, a remark, a hesitation, spoke louder than declarations. Purbright allowed himself a moment to appreciate the pattern. The pieces were moving, each in its natural rhythm, responding to subtle prompts and to the expectations of the town. When the moment came, He knew the truth would be visible not through confession, but through the very behaviour that had been observed and recorded with patience over many days. And with that he closed his notebook, aware that the next days would bring further slips, further hesitations, and finally the moment when the carefully orchestrated test would yield the revelation he had been waiting to observe. It was on a mild Thursday afternoon that Inspector Purbright decided the time had come to assemble the elements of the case in a setting both civil and controlled. He sent discreet invitations to Alderman Wotton, Mr. Goff, and, through the landlord of the Crown and Mitre, to Mrs. Simmons. The purpose was presented as a routine review of civic records, a pretext designed to ensure that each party would arrive without suspicion or alarm. The room in which they met was a modest sitting room in Purbright's own residence, carefully arranged so that each participant could be observed without intrusion. Light fell from the windows in soft, neutral beams, lending the air of ordinariness the inspector preferred. It was precisely the ordinary setting that allowed extraordinary revelations to emerge without the tension of overt accusation. Alderman Wotton arrived first, punctual, his posture rigid. Goff entered a few minutes later, carrying himself with habitual brashness, though he could not conceal the slight edge of unease. Mrs. Simmons came last, gloved hands folded, eyes alert yet composed, betraying no obvious emotion. Purbright greeted each in turn, seating them in a manner designed to allow casual observation. Wotton nearest the window, Goff at a side chair, and Mrs. Simmons equidistant from both, a silent arbiter of attention. The inspector began with matters of mundane record budget allocations, minor tenders, the upkeep of civic gardens. Each subject was handled with calm precision, a careful rhythm of observation and conversation that allowed small slips to become visible. Then, at a prearranged moment, Purbright allowed the glove to rest on the table in front of Wotton, ensuring its placement was casual, almost accidental. He mentioned, gently, that a visitor to the photographer's studio had inquired after images from past civic dinners. Wotton's fingers tightened briefly on the table edge, a subtle but unmistakable motion. Goff's brow furrowed in curiosity, while Mrs. Simmons inclined her head, almost imperceptibly, noting his reaction. Purbright allowed silence to linger, observing the manner in which each participant responded to the presence of these ordinary objects, to the recall of minor past events, and to the understated weight of implication. After a pause, he spoke again, carefully, addressing all three. "It seems," he said, "that a letter and a glove have caused considerable perturbation. We are fortunate, however, to have witnesses who can clarify the circumstances." He turned to Mrs. Simmons. "Would you, madam, care to explain your interest in the photographs?" Mrs. Simmons's voice was steady, polite, yet carried the faintest edge of relief. "I wished to obtain images of council dinners from the past," she said, "to understand the social dynamics of the town, and to illustrate a small history for a publication I am preparing. The envelope, the glove, was not intended to alarm anyone. I handed the note to a waiter simply to deliver it discreetly, to avoid embarrassing Mr. Wotton in public." Purbright nodded. "And the photograph mentioned by Mr. Goff?" "Ah," she said, "that too was incidental. I had inquired whether Mr. Fenning retained negatives of past dinners, perhaps including some from the event 15 years ago, in which a young Mr. Wotton had been photographed alongside his late wife. It was a curiosity for a historical record, nothing more." The room remained silent for a heartbeat. Then Wotton, pale but visibly relieved, let out a breath he had been holding. "Inspector," he said, "it was merely the worry that some past indiscretion might be exposed, a private moment rendered public. There was no blackmail, no threat, simply a misunderstanding inflated by circumstance and the town's eagerness for drama. Goff, for his part, chuckled softly. I confess I allowed my imagination to run wild. Seeing the glove, hearing talk of photographs, I assumed, foolishly, that some scheme was afoot. Purbright allowed the observation to settle. And so it appears, he said, that what seemed sinister was in fact a series of coincidences, each magnified by our own anticipations. The envelope, the glove, the inquiries, they had only appeared more threatening because each of us, in our way, attributed intent beyond reality. The tension in the room eased noticeably. Mrs. Simmons removed her gloves briefly, revealing hands composed yet capable of decisive action. Wotton straightened, regaining a measure of his habitual dignity. Goff relaxed his shoulders, returning to his natural brashness, but with an undertone of sheepishness. Purbright reflected, as he often did, that human behavior was rarely simple. The smallest artifacts, a letter, a glove, a photograph, could influence a sequence of events in ways disproportionate to their actual significance. People responded not merely to actions but to perceived intentions, to imagined consequences. It was in those responses that he had found the clues necessary to understand the truth. He allowed a final, quiet remark. In Flaxborough, he said, we tend to see scandal where there is none, and to suspect malice where there is only care or curiosity. It is the vigilance of the observer, the attention to minor gestures, that separates misunderstanding from true mischief. The group rose, exchanging polite acknowledgments. Outside, the drizzle had ceased, leaving the streets of Flaxborough gleaming under the afternoon light. The inspector watched each of them depart, noting how the tension of days past had yielded to ordinary composure. The town would continue its chatter. Of course, exaggeration and embellishment were the lifeblood of small-town conversation, but the principal actors now carried clarity and relief in place of anxiety and suspicion. Purbright sat back in his chair, the faintest smile crossing his face. The case had been resolved not by force, nor by accusations, but by patience, careful observation, and an appreciation of human nature's subtleties. The envelope, the glove, the photograph, they had each played their part in a drama of perception, yet the truth had remained simple, civil, and quietly instructive. He took up his pen, noting the outcome for the record, misunderstanding resolved, no malice, no crime, only the gentle reveal of human apprehension and the town's own propensity for embellishment. The mystery, in its understated way, was concluded, and Flaxborough could return, slowly, to its habitual rhythms. By the following week, Flaxborough had settled once more into its familiar routines, the streets and lanes resuming their customary rhythm. Shopkeepers arranged their goods with habitual precision, children ran errands for their parents, and council meetings proceeded with their usual combination of decorum and mild simmering disagreement. The town, as was its wont, had already begun to reweave the narrative of the envelope and the glove into a story more colourful than the reality warranted. Yet beneath the embellishment, the essential truth remained simple, and Inspector Purbright, observing from the margin, found satisfaction in the quiet restoration of order. Alderman Wotton had returned to his office with measured resolve. The pallor of apprehension had faded, replaced by the careful authority that suited his station. He no longer flinched at minor correspondence, nor did he avoid public appearances. Yet there was a subtle difference in his step, a small humility gained from the realization that even men of standing could be unsettled by the quiet machinations of coincidence and the eager imagination of their neighbours. Mr. Goff, meanwhile, resumed his brash commentary on council contracts and the unfairness of delayed payments. His awareness of the photograph and the glove had taught him only that imagination could conjure scenarios more alarming than any reality. He chuckled over his own presumption, sharing the story with a select few of his colleagues, who found in his confession both amusement and mild relief that he had not, in fact, been guilty of mischief. Mrs. Simmons, for her part, continued her quiet work of collecting photographs and historical accounts. Her presence in town, once a source of minor speculation, became merely an accepted curiosity. People smiled at her meticulous inquiries, wondering whether she might be preparing a volume on Flaxborough society, and then promptly returned to discussions of seed prices, bridge hands, and the occasional mismanaged pothole. She carried herself with the composure of one accustomed to discretion, understanding that her role in the recent drama had been both accidental and instructive. Inspector Purbright returned to his office, placing the glove in its drawer alongside his notes and the careful records of observation. He allowed himself a moment to reflect on the pattern of human behavior he had witnessed, the eagerness to assume malice, the subtle betrayals of gesture and hesitation, the amplification of coincidence into apparent scandal. Flaxborough, in its peculiar way, had provided both the theatre and the audience necessary for revelation. He considered the town itself, its network of observation, gossip, and embellishment. It was neither malevolent nor particularly wise, but it was consistent in its curiosity. And that consistency, Purbright mused, was often more useful than explicit testimony. In small towns, he had learned, truth was seldom declared. It was revealed through nuance, through the smallest of tremors and hesitations, through the careful reading of ordinary people performing their ordinary tasks. The envelope, once so threatening, had been folded into insignificance. The glove, carefully preserved, had proved a guide rather than a clue. The photograph, the central curiosity, had revealed nothing scandalous, nothing intended to harm, only the faint echo of past civic life observed with careful interest. And the town, already eager to imagine narrative where none existed, had supplied drama sufficient to unsettle even an alderman. Purbright leaned back in his chair, allowing the quiet of the office to settle around him. The sergeant, ever vigilant, had returned to routine duties, satisfied that the town's social equilibrium had been restored. Outside, the streets of Flaxborough glimmered with a late afternoon sun, shops prepared to close, and children began the familiar journey home from school. He made a note in his ledger case resolved, no crime committed, misunderstandings clarified, human nature observed in full. He poured himself a small glass of whiskey, sipped it slowly, and allowed himself the faintest smile. Life, as always, continued to be resilient, petty, charming, and entirely predictable once its patterns were properly read. The town would chatter, embellish, and speculate, as towns do. But beneath all that, the essential truth, the sequence of letters, gloves, inquiries, and subtle hesitation had been quietly restored to its proper place. Flaxborough's ordinary rhythms prevailed once more, and the inspector returned to his work, content in the knowledge that patience, observation, and a light touch had sufficed where accusation or force would have failed. With the file closed and the notes carefully arranged, Inspector Purbright allowed the soft hum of routine to fill the station. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves along the high street. Somewhere a clock struck its hour and the town moved on, none the worse for the mild perturbation that had passed. The envelope had been harmless, the glove an innocent remnant, and the photograph a curiosity. The human heart, however, had proved as subtle and intricate as ever, and the inspector, quietly satisfied, returned to his paperwork with the calm awareness that understanding was often more enduring than drama.